This program on monuments, I came up with this idea about 6 months ago when the Richmond mayor appointed the Monument Avenue Commission to decide what to do with Monument Avenue, particularly to look into ideas to contextualize the Monument Avenue statues. And by the way, I'll be using monument and statue interchangeably just to change it up a bit. No magic to it, nothing, no key, no code to it. Just to vary the fare a bit, they mean the same thing to me. But to contextualize them, either with interpretive signage or by adding more monuments to tell a broader, more diverse, inclusive story on Monument Avenue. And the commission was to report sometime about now, mid-November. And as you know, I think, unless you've been living under the proverbial rock for the last few months, a lot has happened since then, which has made me wonder, what was I thinking when I volunteered to give this talk? So I've been at the museum as of the end of this month, I think, half my life, almost 30 years. And I've had a lot of time to think about monuments and Confederate symbols, occasionally talk about it, read about it. But I'm really before you tonight not as an expert, but as someone just like you, trying to understand what's going on and trying to understand the world, which has changed a lot in my 30 years at the museum and a lot in just the last year or two in particular. So this is really an exercise of kind of thinking aloud, I hope somewhat wisely and sagely, about monuments and the debate about the monuments today. Just a little bit about my association. I'm not going to tell you where I stand on this issue. I'm hoping you won't be able to even guess, and there's reason to that madness. But I'm of that generation that I grew up with Confederate monuments just as a part of my landscape and accepted them as part of my landscape. I'm a Civil War guy from the 4th grade or 7th grade on. So I'm a Civil War student, and they mean to me the Civil War. Yes, when I moved to Richmond in 1988, I laughed at when I started hearing people talking about Monument Avenue statues as those second place trophies, which is the title for the talk tonight for that reason, or participation trophies, some people have called them. I thought that was cute and ironic, but I've never been uncomfortable with them. But as a citizen of the world, Patrick, come on up. You can. Okay, good. Okay, he wants to get more pie. That's it. Yeah, he's hogging the pie. If it's all gone by the end of the talk, you know where it's coming. But as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world right now, I'm trying to look at this issue objectively, not subjectively, and try to transcend my subjective reactions to what's going on. And my friends and family and neighbors can tell you that I have my share of subjective reactions. Now, Josie told you about my work on the Confederate battle flag, and I'm trying to apply to the subject of monuments the same kinds of logic I did and the same approach I did in writing about the Confederate battle flag. My mantra has always been the necessity of background and perspective, and having to look at history as being something that's very complex and very ambiguous, to appreciate and embrace that complexity and that ambiguity. So my purpose tonight is to talk about the subject of monuments with as many facets as perspectives as possible, so that we can better understand the various viewpoints about the Confederate monuments. I went into Confederate battle flag, automatic pilot right there. I have to pull me back every now and then. But to look at the different perspectives and the assumptions, the argument and the logic that lies behind these various positions. All of us have strong opinions about monuments on this subject. But we know from talking to people and just watching the news that not everyone shares your opinion. The natural reaction, of course, for most of us is to dismiss people who don't agree with you as wrong, dead wrong, absolutely wrong, wrong-headed, evil. Just to dismiss them as if they don't agree with you. That's the natural reaction. Or in today's parlance, to dismiss them as to call them racist or fascist or politically correct or some other endearing name like that. But just because this is a natural tendency doesn't make it right. Now, I'm a classic film buff fan, so I have to quote Katharine Hepburn talking to Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen. Nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we're put on this earth to rise above. So I'm going to ask you all tonight to rise above your own natures and to listen to what I'm going to be talking about with open minds, because the purpose we have in mind tonight is to try to understand why other people do not agree with you, why there are different and conflicting opinions about Confederate monuments. Whether or not you're just trying to win an argument with somebody else or genuinely understand them, it behooves you to try to understand where they're coming from. And that's what I'm going to try to do tonight, to cover a lot of ground in the process. I'll be focusing on Monument Avenue, but a lot of what I'm going to be saying applies to, or is relevant to, statues and monuments in cities and towns all over Virginia and all over the South. I could just go through a laundry list of interesting observations about context and perspectives about the debates over monuments, and essentially that's what I'm going to do, but I'm going to use a framework for this discussion that I hope that you will find as useful as I have found it in my own studies. And what this framework is based on some insights from social scientists, that there are three different periods, contexts if you will, that are important for viewing and understanding monuments. First of all is the period that is, for historical monuments, the period being commemorated. Particularly when there's monuments of Civil War figures, the obvious answer is it's the Civil War. That's the one period, is the period being commemorated by historical monuments. So in this case, the Civil War, the Confederacy. The second period is the period in which those monuments were conceived and built. In this case, it's the period between 1870 and 1929, the Monument Avenue building period that I'll be talking about. On a daily basis, most of us don't really think much about where monuments came from. As far as we were concerned, unless we were there when they were built, they were always there. We don't ask many questions about how they got there, but we know intuitively that someone, groups and individuals, made them happen. They didn't get there by themselves. And I think we can all agree that the most important period in viewing a monument, or in the life of the monument anyway, is the creation period. If no one cared enough to put them there, they wouldn't be there, and we wouldn't be talking about them or debating about them today. So we need to understand the context of the period in which they were erected, probably most importantly. And the third period that is important for viewing and talking about monuments is today. How we ourselves as individuals and collectively, how we view them and how we interact with them. It's just common sense that when we're talking and debating about monuments, we bring our own world and our own values and our own experiences and our own prejudices into the experience of interacting with these monuments. So we need to talk about us and how we interact. So those are the three basic framework categories I'm going to be pursuing throughout this talk tonight. All of these are important for understanding the debates that we're experiencing and probably engaging in today. So let's start with the historical context. The era of these monuments, the era that is being commemorated with these monuments, is Civil War. They depict prominent Civil War figures. This is the history that people talk about when we talk about monuments. The history that some people warn us will be erased if the monuments are brought down and removed. So it makes sense to see what these monuments teach us about history, and that's why I have some slides tonight. For those of you who haven't been down Monument Avenue in a while, I'm going to take you on a quick tour, but this is a focused tour. I'm going to be presenting the statues in the order in which they were built. And the questions that we want to ask of them is what history do they teach us? If these statues are about Civil War history, what kind of history do they teach us? What would be lost if they were taken down? How exactly do they teach us? What do they tell us about history? So start with Robert E. Lee, of course, dedicated in 1890. And monuments, of course, we can look at it right away, and we know that there's a couple different ways in which statues potentially can communicate history to us. One is by the sculpture itself, and the other is by the inscription, any writing that might be on it. So for Lee, it's a big monument with a man on a horseback. And we can't tell whether he's in uniform because it's too high up there, but it's an impressive monument. But I'm not learning a lot from it except it's a man on horseback. And what's the inscription? Lee. I used to joke that the inscription tells you one thing: if you don't know who this guy is, you don't belong here. That's essentially the message that it sends. Maybe less facetiously, it tells us that at one time this man was so well known that that's all you needed. His presumably last name, again I'm being facetious, but really think if you knew nothing about this man and you ran across this monument, you're not from around here, and you want to learn some history from this monument, how much will you really learn? Either his first name or his last name is Lee, and that's it. You will not learn anything that you didn't already know beforehand. So it's not really teaching much. Jeb Stuart, doing a little bit better, is a man on horseback, more clearly in a uniform with an interesting hat. Equestrian statue once again. And there's quite a bit of writing on the Jeb Stuart Monument, sort of a mini biography. His name, his birth date, where he was born, where he was mortally wounded, where he died, and what his role was in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, who cared enough who made it happen. A little bit of misinformation. It was actually dedicated in 1907 to 1906. They jumped the gun a bit. A little bit about him. And he gave his life for his country and saved this city from capture. So it establishes why a monument to Jeb Stuart is in Richmond, Virginia. It is a little mini history, and with testimonials by a couple of other generals named Jackson and Lee. So it does serve to educate anybody who can get close enough to it on Stuart Circle to learn about the life and the contributions and the importance of J.E.B. Stuart. Jefferson Davis, also dedicated 4 days later down the street in 1907. A man hailing a taxi cab or trying to catch a bird on his hand, and with the classical architecture almost overwhelming him, with a shaft, and you can't see it, with a classical figure, which we know to be Vindicatrix on top of the shaft. This architectural frieze includes a quote from Jefferson Davis about the nature of the government he led, and also these seals that you see embedded above them throughout the frieze, dedicated to each, if you get close enough, one to each state of the Confederacy, plus Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland. States, in other words, that either belong to the Confederacy or contributed troops to the Confederacy. Testimonial about him. As a citizen, soldier, statesman, he enhanced the glory and enlarged the fame of the United States. When his allegiance to that government was terminated by his sovereign state as president of the Confederate States, he exalted his country before the nations. And then also tablets, bronze tablets to the Army of the Confederate States and the Navy of the Confederate States. So clearly this monument is to a man, but to much more. To a nation that he led, to principles, and to the armed forces of the government that he led. Stonewall Jackson. And if you look on both sides, it's Stonewall Jackson. If you want to know his first name, you're out of luck. Stonewall. He's another man in uniform on a horse. Born 1824, killed at Chancellorsville, 1863. Anybody have a problem with that?
Mortally wounded.
Mortally wounded. That's what my wife calls out every time she passes by. And she's in good company. The ladies of the CMLS, the parent organization of the Museum of the Confederacy, registered strong opposition, untrue to history, misled. So we have some misleading history on this monument. If you're a literalist, this monument actually teaches bad history. And then finally down the street is a fellow sitting in front of a globe, oldish looking man in civilian dress, bookish looking sort in front of a storm-swept globe. Maury. Is that like Maury Wills? Maury Povich? Which Maury is this? It doesn't look like a base stealer, but Maury, Pathfinder of the Seas. Doesn't tell us a lot. I thought, at least until Maury, all the monuments were supposed to be Confederate. What is this? Does this tell us why he's on a boulevard, an avenue of Confederates? It really doesn't. Doesn't tell us much, except that some guy named Maury, maybe his first name, maybe his last name, was the Pathfinder of the Seas. So it really doesn't teach us a lot. Now that's sort of a facetious tour through the monuments on Monument Avenue, but I approach it that way because we have to see it through the eyes of people who don't know Civil War Confederate history. Clearly this was built for a generation that did know these people, although Maury, one reason they built this was because he's so often forgotten. So it doesn't really teach us a lot of outright history the way we're used to being taught history. These monuments they teach us history in another way beyond the sculpture and beyond the inscription. Their scale tells us something, it communicates something to us. They were important. At least they were regarded as very important at the time these monuments were built, this heroic scale. It also, in the inscriptions, particularly of Stuart and of Davis, is offering not historical fact, but historical interpretation, not objective fact, but a subjective historical interpretation, a glorification, a celebration of these men. It's implicit in all of them. It's explicit with Stuart and with Davis. So there's the fundamental distinction between simply acknowledging the facts of history and the difference between that and offering a specific interpretation of history is one of the issues involved in the debates of the statues today. Is this history or is this propaganda? Is this spin control rather than history as an objective teaching of history? So when returning to those issues I raised earlier, what would you lose if these monuments were taken down? Would you not be able to learn about history? Regardless of our subjective feelings about monuments, we know that monuments are not the means by which most people learn history. If that were true, we would not know a thing about the 99% of people who never make it onto a monument, but yet we do. We know that we get most of our history from books and from school, not from monuments. But let's move on to the perspective of the time in which the monuments were built, conceived and built. 1870 to 1929 in the case of Monument Avenue. And at this point I need to, as an aside, to offer a corrective for some things you might be reading and hearing. Some people claim that because the first statue, that of Lee, was not unveiled until 1890, 25 years after the war, these monuments couldn't have had anything to do with the Civil War. That's misleading. The Lee monument was first conceived in October of 1870, days after Lee died. Monuments to people are almost never started until after they died. So Lee died first in 1870, and days later, an organization formed to build a monument to him. Davis, same thing, in December of 1889. Stuart, same thing, really. The city of Richmond promised to build a monument in 1864 after he was killed. It took 50 years to get around to it, but they had made the early effort. So these monuments have more of a connection to Civil War history than many people talk about today. There's an unfortunate tendency to use that 1890 date and say that it was so remote from the Civil War that it couldn't have been about the war, but that's simply not true. But still, these monuments were not products of the Civil War. They didn't emerge from the war, and they would not have happened, they would not have gone up if people had not cared about them in subsequent generations. So it's those subsequent generations we need to study to know why those monuments got there to begin with. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next short time. These monuments, in other words, tell us as much, or I would say more, about the period in which they were erected than they do about the period that they commemorate, the war period itself. So what was going on during the Monument Avenue building period? And I should also add parenthetically that this is the same period between 1890 and 1920 that most Confederate monuments were built. Not just these heroic statues on Monument Avenue, these second-place trophies, but this common soldier statues, as the ones in here in Appomattox and in almost every courthouse in Virginia and throughout the South. Those monuments, too, date mostly to the same time frame of 1870, certainly, and probably 1890, 1929. So what I'm going to say about these monuments on Monument Avenue apply generally to Confederate monuments. So one thing that was going on, certainly in that time frame, we have to confront it, was the rise of a new form of white supremacy to replace slavery. After the destruction of slavery, a new form of racial, social, and political control that arose in the South after the South redeemed itself, quote unquote, redeemed from Reconstruction rule. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center's timeline on their website that traces the period of traces the monuments, the building of monuments in the South, Confederate monuments, along a timeline with leading incidents in the Civil Rights era, with the emergence of Jim Crow and then later the fight against desegregation in the South, and tracks them side by side and shows that there's a correlation between the two. That has become very influential, particularly when you read in the media, a very widely cited timeline. And in fact, there seems to be a correlation. If you do trace them side by side, this was the exact same era that the monuments were going up, was also the era in which Jim Crow segregation was established. But of course, it's a logical fallacy to assume a causal relationship between those two, to assume it. There may very well have been a relationship, but there may not have been a relationship. Reading through the records of 3 of these monument associations that built these monuments, I can tell you there's not a word about slavery, race, white supremacy, anything. So if we can draw conclusions from the words of the people responsible for erecting these monuments, they did not erect them because of white supremacy. But there were relationships, nevertheless, between the monuments and white supremacy. The most obvious and undeniable is that if not for the fact of white supremacy in that era, white supremacy and, on the flip side, the marginalization, the exclusion of African Americans from the body politic, if not for that, those monuments likely would not have gone up where they did, when they did. They would not have gone up on public property, as they all did, with public funding, as they all did. If African Americans had political power commensurate with their numbers in the city of Richmond, they would have been able to prevent them. So on that level alone, the monuments are testaments to black powerlessness during that era. And also the fact is that the men and women who were responsible for Confederate monuments were also, in many cases, not every one of them, the people who were responsible for erecting Jim Crow segregation at the same time. The question for us to try to understand what was going on then is, do we need that proverbial smoking gun to believe that there was some relationship between those two things, the creation of the monuments and the creation of Jim Crow segregation? Or were these people capable of compartmentalizing their interests and their activities and not allowing their work in creating a white supremacist political order to influence at all their work on Confederate monuments? Naturally, that's one of the great points of disagreements today in talking about Confederate monuments. But what else was going on during this era that might explain why people cared enough to build all these Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue and throughout the South? Well, the Civil War generation, those who fought and experienced the war, were at the height of their power in both North and the South, just passing the torch, as John Kennedy would tell us, to a new generation at that time. And they were at the height also of commemorating the Civil War generation itself, North and South. The period between 1890 and 1920, as I mentioned earlier, was the high point for monument building both in the North and in the South. In other words, while it is true that there is this coincidence between Jim Crow segregation and monuments in the South, there's also a coincidence between monument building in the North, monument building in the South. The same kinds of soldier monuments and same kinds of heroic equestrian monuments in major cities were going up at the very same time in the very same pattern in the North and the South. Could that be the most important temporal contemporaneous context for understanding why Confederate monuments were built between 1890 and 1920? Could that be the real reason for it? And now, for the monuments on Monument Avenue, these statues to major leaders, we have a nice little laboratory control group just on the other side of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., where there were heroic monuments to heroes of the Union cause going up at the very same time. And what you'll find is the exact same pattern. None of these monuments to major figures were begun until after the men had died. And they took years, sometimes decades, even with federal funding, to get the money together to build the monuments and to unveil them. So there was this long lag between the men dying and sometimes with the funding being issued and the monuments going up. So William Sherman died in 1891. His monument by the White House went up in 1903. Philip Sheridan's went up in 1908, 20 years after his death. George McClellan had to wait 22 years, or his spirit did anyway, for a monument. U.S. Grant, the hero of them all, of the general of the armies of the United States, his monument was Unveiled in 1922, slightly unfinished, finally finished in 1924, 37 years after he died. And George Gordon Meade, the hero of Gettysburg, had to wait 45 years until 1927. So roughly the same era as the Monument Avenue statues for these heroic equestrian statues in Washington, D.C. So if race and Jim Crow were a factor in the Southern monuments, why could you not deduce by the same coincidence that they were also a factor in the building of Northern monuments? A rhetorical question that I will ask. But some of you might be asking yourselves, but hold it now, these monuments in Washington, these were the monuments to the winners of the Civil War in the national capital. Winning nations do that kind of thing. From antiquity to the British Empire, the winners would build monuments to their major heroes in their capital cities. Since when do the losers, especially the losers of a bloody Civil War, have the opportunity to erect statues to any of their heroes? The answer, of course, is never, or virtually never. We are the exception to the rule. We know what usually happens to the losers of civil wars. Lots of executions, lots of exiles. There have been all kinds of comparative studies of what happens to the losers of civil wars in the mid-19th century, and comparative studies between the American Civil War and the Spanish Civil War. Not only is it usually worse on the actual losers, but they don't get to erect monuments. Sometimes they don't even get to honor their dead or even mark their graves. So what happened in the United States and in the South was very unusual. The fact that white Southerners were able to honor their dead, their heroes, and their cause, and create this vast commemorative landscape of monuments and more than monuments, is the very foundation of the debate today. It's probably the most important thing we can talk about tonight. Hence the title of my talk, the second place trophies. That the South was given this opportunity to erect this commemorative landscapes, including monuments, is why we're here tonight. It's unusual, it's almost unique in human history. So whether or not you agree with what happened, did not happen to the Confederates after the war, you have to recognize the importance of this point. So let's attack this first by asking the same questions I asked earlier. What was going on in this period between 1870 and 1929 that explains why white former Confederates and Southerners took the trouble to conceive, fund, build, design, go to all the trouble to build these monuments, and for that matter, all the hundreds of monuments here in this community and most communities around the South? Well, for one thing, U.S. veterans were doing the same thing. They were erecting monuments and writing histories that, not unexpectedly, glorified the Union cause, that the North was right. So predictably, the South, given an opportunity, which I'll get to in a moment, did the same thing. They were equally determined to build monuments to their dead, to the men who fought, and to their heroes, and to publish their own histories to trumpet the righteousness of their own cause. Now, it's easy to understand why white Southerners did that. They suffered enormous losses, physical, property losses, and losses in lives during the war. But unlike the victorious North, the white South had nothing to show for all that loss, for all that carnage, and they had that sacrifice and blood and treasure, nothing to compensate. Erecting monuments to fallen heroes was a means of showing the world and to future generations that they cared about these men. They honored them even though they lost. It was a way of finding meaning in defeat and and achieving a kind of victory in defeat. But Confederate monuments went beyond mourning and honoring the dead. And this is another one of these critical points in understanding the debates today. They went beyond mourning the dead. They also sought to vindicate the Confederate cause as well as the men who fought for it, proclaiming that although we lost the war, we were right and the cause for which our men fought was noble. Now this leads to this coherent body of thought that we talk about today, what Southerners themselves refer to as the lost cause. It's a term that again has currency in our current day debates. It's usually used today as a pejorative term for Confederate propaganda or for a version of Civil War history that distorted the truth, erased history by erasing African Americans from the script, and erasing any mention of slavery, though it was the most important factor in secession and ultimately in war. And it exerted this baneful influence over Americans' understanding of history for almost a century, is what the lost cause is generally referred to in our discussions today. Now, the desire to do this was understandable, but how was it that the South got to do what no other defeated people had ever been able to do? The answer simply is a combination of Southern determination to vindicate their cause and Northern and federal government acquiescence in it, for a host of reasons I don't have time to go into, but I think you know them. For political reasons, the North and South were reunited, and the South was again a political player in the federal government. It was prudent for Northern politicians, particularly Northern Democrats, to give in to Southern symbolic demands. Hey, why not? And then Northern veterans gave in. They never gave in as much as we sometimes think they did. Northern veterans continued to think, Union veterans continued to think that we were right, they were wrong. As long as we agree to disagree about the causes of the war and the morality of the war, we can appreciate your bravery, and we can allow you to raise monuments to your dead because we appreciate your bravery as fighting men. It was that kind of a bargain made during the war generation and after the war and in the generations that allowed Southerners to freedom to erect this vast commemorative landscapes of monuments. And of course, Northerners and Southerners, white Northerners and Southerners, also shared a racial prejudice, which also cemented a bond that allowed the South to go about not only creating Confederate monuments, but to go about creating a new form of racial control in the form of Jim Crow. Let me read you a quote that I ran across in a new book by Robert Cook last week that I think says a lot. This is from the editorial in the Charleston News and Courier in December 1889 at the time of Jefferson Davis's death. All that the Southern people demand. Okay, now think about listen to what I'm about to say. All that the Southern people demand, this little pittance, this humble demand that they're making, and ask yourself, is this really all that they're asking in the context of people defeated in a bloody civil war? Is recognition of their patriotic purpose in the act of secession, that the Confederate War was a war of independence and not an act of conspiracy, and that having done their best endeavoring what they believe to be right and having failed, they are worthy to stand side by side as American citizens with those of other sections of the Union who fought for what they believed to be right and succeeded. So that was essentially the terms on which the South wanted reconciliation with the North, and uniquely, they got it. That's really, when you think about it, that's an amazing demand for a defeated people to make, and they got it. William T. Sherman, 2 years earlier, wrote to a friend, "The rebels succeed in their claim to have been the Simon Pure patriots and Union men of our day and generation. They have partially succeeded and may completely succeed. The acquiescence of Northerners to white Southerners' insistence on the right to honor their dead and celebrate their cause is, figuratively speaking, the foundation on which monuments rest." And I'll be talking more about that later. Now, we know in retrospect that this occurred not only with the acquiescence of veterans, but also Hollywood and New York publishers and the federal government. So hence we have army bases named for Confederate heroes. We have Gone with the Wind. We have books that all influence the whole nation to have this favorable attitude toward the Confederacy. And this made sense during the era of the World Wars and of the Cold War. For a nation to be united, it had to have a shared history. So it made a lot of sense for this sort of feel-good reconciliationist vision of the Confederacy and the Civil War during this era. Subsequent generations of Americans, especially tourists and white Southerners, actively supported or passively accepted this kind of landscape as a given. And of course, in our own day, any effort to change this landscape is understandably seen as an attack on the past, and more about that later, because people are emotionally invested in that past. And as we know, more recent generations have challenged that landscape and challenged that intellectual foundation that rests underneath it. Just ask General John Kelly about that. We learned a couple of weeks ago what happens when you try to articulate a vision from 50 years ago about the Civil War, but more on that again later. But with that in mind, let's turn to our own time. to how we as individuals collectively engage with monuments today, because that is very much a part of the discussion of monuments. We all have our own opinions, but our singular opinion doesn't mean a lot. Collectively, they do mean a lot, because this is how we as a nation not only engage with monuments, but how and why this diverse public debates about them. So look, there's some obvious factors here in how we, the collective we, views monuments. Some of them are racial, demographic categories like race. Obviously, African Americans view the monuments differently than white people do. Your regional origin has a lot to do with it. Your family background, do you descend from Confederate veterans? Ideological factors. Some people are neo-Confederate, others are neo-abolitionist. If you're interested in history, as I was growing up, and you're more likely to think of these monuments as, well, history. If you have higher education, you've probably been exposed to more critical views of the Confederacy. Now, some of you might think that's just political correctness, and other people would say that's good critical thinking. But in either case, education and views on Confederate monuments do go hand in hand. It's also important what social circles you move in. Do you have a diverse social circle of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds? If you do, you're more than likely going to view the world differently, either through the eyes of other people, or they're going to influence the way you view the world. And what was your upbringing? Were you brought up in a household in which you had a benign view of the Confederacy and the Civil War, that you believed either that the South was right or at least it wasn't wrong, and had no problem with Confederate symbols when you were growing up? And for that matter, your own temperament. Are you a contrarian? You always want to poke holes in received wisdom and things that you grew up with? Or do you accept it, or do you tend to reject it? All these factors may seem trivial and a bit idiosyncratic, but they matter because we're talking now about our own time and how people react to Civil War monuments. And there are also, finally, what I consider zeitgeist factors, what I call zeitgeist factors, the spirit of the times. What's going on today in our own political and cultural life that might affect how we as individuals and how certainly collectively we deal with monuments? For me, one of the most important are the demographic changes. Not only the fact that we're becoming a nation that is less white, more non-white, and more immigrants from countries that have no stake in our Civil War, but even among us, millennials. To my observation has been for several years now that the millennial generation, speaking broadly and overgeneralizing no doubt, has very little investment in the Confederacy. They grew up at a time when slavery has been now for a generation or more taught as the central cause of the war. And their parents, being largely baby boomers who similarly grew up with a more critical attitude toward the Confederacy and the Civil War, what I have detected in my interactions with younger people is that instead of accepting the landscape as a given, their reaction is, why are all these statues around here to slaveholders? How'd that happen? Why are they still up? It's a background, it's a generational approach that tends to see the inherited landscape as wrong, not as a given, not as a birthright, but as a problem to be solved. But also the Black Lives Matter movement is a big part of this. It's independent of Confederate monuments, but it obviously feeds into it as people are trying to get whites, myself included, to be more sensitive to white privilege and to the impact of continuing racism on African Americans. And as part of that is to make people more sensitive to the impact of Confederate monuments on African Americans. And of course, in recent years, we have two cities that have now become catchphrases. I don't even need to go into detail, but when someone says Charleston or Charlottesville, you know what I mean. And the impact of those incidents in Charleston and Charlottesville have very much impacted the way people in this country view Confederate monuments and Confederate symbols. There's also the Trump presidency. Now, according to some people, when I say that, what I must be implying is that Trump encourages hate or has given a free pass to the renewal of the hate groups. Other people, when I say that, say, oh yeah, the Trump presidency has created this resistance backlash that in order to get at Trump, they're trying to take down everything that the people who voted for him care about, including Confederate monuments. Either way you slice it, the Trump presidency and all the diverse opinions and very strong opinions on that feed into the dialogue. These are contexts for understanding Monument Avenue as well as monuments generally. And there is a backlash against lost cause history. This has been going on for some time, but it's stronger now than ever. People who, and again, John Kelly, a couple of weeks ago, experienced that people who are challenging the intellectual foundation for Confederate monuments. So now, what I want to try to do is conclude this sort of exercise in thinking aloud about monuments by identifying what I think are a handful of interrelated questions that we as a nation are trying to work out when we talk about Confederate monuments. This first group of questions deals with the nature and the role of monuments in general. How important are they for understanding, teaching history? Conversely, what would we lose or do we lose by removing them? Is it really erasing history? Do they and should they connote, signify approval and honor to their subjects, or do they simply acknowledge the past? And are there advantages to preserving a landscape, warts and all, because this landscape tells us where we've been? Statues aren't there because they make us feel good. Statues are there to tell us where we've been in that school of thought. And that recognizing that these monuments were put there by earlier generations, that they are reflections of earlier generations' priorities and prejudices, more than they really have to do with the history itself, are subsequent generations obligated to keep them forever? Do we have to keep the monuments that we inherit, or should each generation be free to wipe the slate clean and start over again, build its own commemorative landscape? And as we know, this transcends the Confederacy. Confederacy isn't the only group of monuments that are under discussion today. We're talking also about those to slaveholding founding fathers, to segregationists, to Christopher Columbus. The second group of questions deals with specifically Confederate monuments and their purpose. To what degree, in what ways are Confederate statues monuments to white supremacy? Were they erected in order to intimidate African Americans? Do they serve as, quote, rallying points for racists? Or, and these are not mutually exclusive, were the monuments erected for the straightforward purpose of honoring Confederate leaders, and in the case of courthouse monuments, honoring Confederate soldiers, the men who fought and died for the Confederacy? To what degree were these monuments intended not to simply mourn and honor the dead, but also to glorify the cause and perpetuate a kind of propaganda to influence future generations, which clearly they were. That was the whole purpose of building them, is to reach future generations. But are future generations obligated to preserve forever the propaganda, the lost cause propaganda of earlier generations? Let me offer a couple of observations on that group of questions. Now, I believe that the statements are being made today about Confederate monuments being built in order to create, or for the purpose of creating and promoting white supremacy, are dramatically overstated. I think there is clearly, however, a relationship between them, as I mentioned earlier. But for the purpose of white supremacy, I don't see that. But we have to acknowledge that they did more than simply honor the dead. They glorified the Confederacy, and Confederate monuments in their own way erased history. They simplified history. They basically lied to us and to the public. They told a version of history that was one side of the story, and a very skewed side of history at that. So that's part of the problem we're dealing with today, because those monuments did erase history, and unfortunately some people have this vision that two wrongs make a right. But the monuments do at least bear a relationship to white supremacy, because they would not have been there had it not been for white supremacy, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, the questions that we're dealing with today are about the nature of the Confederacy itself and the place of the Confederacy in the modern world, something that I've had to think a lot about over the last 30 years. These monuments on Monument Avenue and elsewhere were placed at a time when white Americans, you have to specify that, white Americans, agreed to disagree on the causes of the war and agreed to allow former Confederates to dominate their own section and propagate their own vision and their own history of the war, and to remember and honor their dead heroes. And it created a national environment among white Americans that good Americans could believe that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, as General Kelly said, and that Americans could and should pay tribute to Confederate heroes. But our subsequent generations of Americans obligated to uphold this sort of reconciliationist consensus of the Civil War that the Civil War generation created and subsequent generations perpetuated for the last century. Or, according to some people today, was the cause of the Confederacy, the perpetuation of slavery, so morally reprehensible and the post-war lost cause so distorted, so harmful to our understanding of history that it shouldn't be tolerated on the landscape. Now, it's important for us to know and remember how unusual it was for Confederates to have had the opportunity to create and perpetuate their own version of history and to influence the whole country's view. The Lost Cause was the prism through which much of this country, in the era of Gone with the Wind, viewed the Civil War. We have to remember how unique that was and how unusual it was for the Confederacy to be able to erect these monuments. But we should question the Lost Cause in the Confederate landscape, commemorative landscape that was built upon it, and we would benefit by questioning some of the old assumptions. But having said that, we have to be careful about not substituting one distorted orthodoxy for another. All history is complex and ambiguous, and when we start talking about an historical epic like the Confederacy as simple, that it was nothing more than slavery, something's wrong. No history is that simple. It's always complex and ambiguous, and we distort history by trying to reduce it to complex history to something that simple. Labeling and judging are not the same as understanding, and I'm afraid what some people want to do now is simply label the Confederacy, judge it as simply nothing more than the perpetuation of slavery, and close the book on it, and not try to understand the complexity of the Confederacy and the people who supported it. I think we would all lose if we allowed that to happen. But the problem we're facing now is not a theoretical one, an abstract one that I reflected in those questions, but a real tangible one. We have these things, these monuments. What are we going to do with them? Is there some compromise? Ooh, that word. Is there some accommodation that we can reach about what to do with these tangible physical monuments? Can we as a community, can we as a nation agree on a solution? I mentioned the mayor's Monument Avenue Commission way back when at the beginning of this talk, in which he recommended contextualizing, recommended the solution, very popular in some places, contextualizing them with signage or with additional monuments. Is that still viable today after Charlottesville? That's where we are, and that's where I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention.